Hello and welcome back to this, the last video in a series of our slow read of Aristotle's Nicomachean and Ethics, and we've made it to book 10. Now book 10 is not a particularly difficult book. I think it's quite straightforward to read, although it does have a very big question that we'll come to in a sec. So he's back to discussing pleasure again, because pleasure is such an important part of human nature. So here we have again Aristotle's interest in what we're like as a species, as a natural being. And he also thinks that it is important for the virtuous person to like doing the right things, and pleasure can be motivating. Therefore, there is a reason here to study pleasure and what is motivating for us. He almost alludes to the importance of operant conditioning here. So he starts by considering and rejecting three different accounts of pleasure. The first one is the idea, the proposal, that pleasure might be the supreme good. So if we look at what we like, we can see self-evidently that pleasure is attractive for us and pain is repulsive. So maybe an argument can be made here that what is desirable, what is pleasurable is good, and what is most desirable is the best, therefore pleasure is the supreme good. But Aristotle, as you would expect, rejects this argument because all it shows is that pleasure is a good, one of many. He also argues that pleasure becomes better with the addition of intellect, with the addition of a targeted approach about what should be pleasurable rather than a reaction to pleasurable things. And that means that it can't be the good because it becomes better with the addition of something else. The second view that he considers and rejects is the idea that pleasure is not good. Now he thinks quite quickly that it is impossible to take this view seriously because intelligent creatures like us are attracted to pleasure. The claim here about proponents of this idea that pleasure is not good is that pleasure is subjective. We can see how it differs from one person to another, and that means that it's not good. But for Aristotle here, the answer is that pleasure doesn't need to be determinate in order to be objective. He's made this point before. We know that Aristotle is not a relativist about moral truth. If you don't understand what those words mean, please go and look at the video on moral relativism and hopefully things will become clear. So Aristotle is very much an objectivist about truth, about moral truth, but that doesn't mean that the answer is the same in each instance. And here is a very good example of that position with respect to pleasure. Pleasure can be a different thing with respect to different people, so it can apply differently in different situations, but that still doesn't mean that it is subjective in a problematic, relativistic kind of way. Okay, the third possibility is that some people point to the fact that some pleasures are bad. This, though, only shows us that disreputable pleasures are bad. It doesn't show us that all pleasures are bad. What should we expect other than the fact that vicious people will take pleasure in vicious things? But that doesn't mean that torturing kittens becomes pleasurable. It just means that the wrong kind of people take the wrong kind of pleasures in the wrong kind of things. So in conclusion of this discussion of pleasure against other people's views is the idea that pleasure is not the good, it's just a good. That not every pleasure is desirable. We can say that some taking pleasure in some kinds of things result in bad kinds of pleasures. And some pleasures are superior to others, the ones that are targeted appropriately by the intellect. Another point about pleasure is that, like seeing, it is not a process, it is instantaneous, it just happens and it is complete at any given moment when you feel it. And then he follows this with a few observations about pleasure. As long as the activity of any sense and the exercise of the intellect are in the right condition, they have been habituated towards the right kind of direction, they bring pleasure. So virtue and pleasure kind of go hand in hand in this way. We can feel more pleasure at the beginning of something, or we can feel more pleasure when there is something novel and interesting. This can fade with time. And the life of activity, the life of virtue, is a form of pleasure in itself. Pleasure cannot occur without activity, and every activity, when it is perfected, brings pleasure. Pleasures can also differ in kinds. Some pleasures can intensify activities, and each activity has a virtue proper to it. That's why we have different kinds of pleasures. different species even have different kinds of pleasures. So what we feel pleasure towards is a matter of what we're like as a species. This is a question about our biology. This is a question about our nature. Again, Aristotelian connections with what we're like as human beings. Having said all that, the good man is the standard in what is pleasurable, because one of the things he does in virtue of being the good person, the virtuous agent, is being able to feel pleasure at the right kind of things. Okay, so after pleasure, he goes back to discussing flourishing. This is this complicated notion that sometimes is translated as happiness, but I think flourishing is a better translation of this term. So this kind of flourishing, it's not a state. Otherwise, people who were asleep would be able to be said to be flourishing in this respect. Rather, it is an activity. And it's an activity which is chosen for its own sake and which is self-sufficient. This is a reiteration of things that he has argued for before. Pleasure is not mere amusement, and happiness is a life, or happiness as flourishing, is a life lived in accordance with reason. So if this kind of flourishing is an activity in accordance with virtue, it must be in accordance with the highest virtue. And what is the highest virtue? The virtue of the highest part of being human, then that is reason. Now, up to that point, almost, he has reiterated things that he has said before about the importance of reason as well, about the importance of associating virtue with pleasure, about the flourishing life being a life of activity. But here he goes a little step further from anything he has said before, because he makes a stronger connection between the flourishing life and reason, and a life in which exercise of reason leads to flourishing, a life of contemplation. And this is the problem with Book 10, in that what he says next doesn't quite fit in with what he has said before. Before, he has focused on this idea of activity as the exercise of virtue. Now he seems to say that amongst the flourishing lives, the best one is one of contemplation. And of course, contemplation doesn't involve any practical kind of activity. Contemplation is still an activity, he says so clearly, but it's not a practical kind of activity. Okay. What is contemplation? It is the highest form of activity. So we know from before that he has different accounts of the flourishing life, but now there's at least one account, the life of contemplation, which is above all others. It is the most continuous. The pleasure we get from this kind of contemplation, acquiring wisdom, is the highest. And here, of course, he's thinking of philosophers, because philosophers are the wisest, and they're the people who devote their entire lives to contemplation. And he thinks that doing philosophy entails kinds of pleasures that are not available to any other kind of activity, because they are marvelous in their purity and in their permanence. The wise man is the most self-sufficient, because he can contemplate by himself. So again, here we have a point that contradicts everything he has said so far. The good life, the virtuous life so far, has been steeped into influences and external goods and needs that other people can provide for it to flourish and to work well, for this activity to take place. We need external goods. We need money for liberality and magnificence. We need the right circumstances to act in order to be brave. We need the temptation to be there to avoid it, for temperance, to show temperance. So we need the friends who are such a big part of becoming virtuous, for emulation, for enjoying the good life. And all these things are external. But suddenly he says the life of contemplation, which is independent of all these external factors, is the best. And that's quite different from what he said so far. And it is the life of contemplation, it is appreciated for its own sake, because nothing extra comes from it. Now, how is it possible for him to be saying the opposite of what he has said so far? It's difficult to know the answer here, because we need to interpret the text, and different people will give you different interpretations. One possible interpretation that I think has quite a lot of textual evidence in what follows is that the intellect and the extent to which we contemplate is an indication of what is divine in us. So we have our human nature, but we have reason as well, which gives us access to the divine. That means that life in accordance with virtue will be flourishing, but to a secondary degree, because it is in accordance with human activities. It is as humans that we live in a world where we need external goods. It's as humans that we interact with other people, therefore we need them in order to lead a flourishing life. So the virtuous life of activity in a world is an expression of our human nature, but it also is a part of us that we can reason, and this links to the divine. It is also a part of human experience to have emotions. I think he's suggesting here that deities would not have emotions. Even practical wisdom, to remember phronesis, another concept that was difficult to translate directly into English. But phronesis, practical wisdom, are sometimes translated as prudence, the intellectual virtue which underlies all the virtues. Even that is an embodied experience. A phronesis is an exercise of something that we do because we're human beings. So it's not something that the gods would share in. The gods were creatures purely of intellect. And happiness of the intellect is a different thing from phronesis. That means that the life of the intellect, this life of contemplation, leads to flourishing, but is the kind of life that we have in virtue of sharing in the divine. And we don't just share in the divine, we are also human beings, embodied, who need external goods, who have emotions. Because of that, all other kinds of flourishing lives of activity are also appropriate to us. And he continues with more arguments as to why the life of perfect flourishing is the life of contemplation. He thinks that none of the virtues are a possibility for the gods. The gods don't have any money to spend, so liberality and magnificence are out. The gods have no evil desires, so temperance is out, yes. Only contemplation is a possibility for the gods. Lower animals cannot be fulfilled at all, because they don't share in any way in contemplation. So we seem to be in the middle. The gods have a flourishing life, fully contemplative life. They don't need any activity. Animals don't share in intellect at all, therefore they cannot lead a flourishing life. And we're somewhere in the middle, because we have our human nature embodied, but we also have this ability to share in the divine through the exercise of reason and contemplation. And he claims that the more you think, the happier you are, which is not a surprise for someone who is a philosopher, and that therefore happiness is a form of contemplation. Because we're not self-sufficient, we will need all the other things for a life of good activity. Nonetheless, the wise man will be happiest to the highest degree, because he leads the best flourishing life. And he finishes off by reiterating some of the things he said so far. Because of our human nature, it's not enough for us simply to discuss virtue, we must practice it. So this book is just the start for more advice on how to practice virtue. He asks the question again, are we good by nature, or is it something that is virtue something that we develop through habit and instruction? And he answers that we can't control our natures, and we can't develop even virtue unless we find ourselves in the right soil properly. So the answer is both things. Yeah, by nature you have to be a little bit lucky. By circumstance you have to find yourself in the right kind of situation, and then habit, exercise, education can lead to the cultivation of virtue. All our feelings have to be habituated in light of the noble and the good. It is difficult though to get the right kind of education in this respect, and he believes that this education should be supervised by the state. This is a very interesting call for public education and state responsibility for educating children. He does think that parents can step in, but only when the state doesn't do a good enough job. So the state's obligation is to educate its citizens so they can then lead a flourishing life, but also that it should punish people so that bad people are fearful of doing the wrong thing. Okay, so what do we need? We need to habituate our feelings. We need to have the right beginnings, the right soil. We need to learn under the guidance of a good system, that's where the state comes in, under compelling laws. So that the evil amongst us feel threatened into doing the right thing, or at least not doing the wrong thing. Yeah. And it's best if the state takes all this over. The sophists cannot teach us how to live well, because their ideas and their advice is not aimed at the good. Their advice is instrumental. Yeah. And therefore what we need is now the politics. And the politics is where he's going to, the book where he's going to discuss the different constitutions. And now you know why he's interested in the constitution of the state, because if the state has this obligation to bring its citizens up so they can lead a flourishing life, then the constitution, how the state is organized, is going to be crucial. That's why the next book is going to look at constitution, how we should rule states, and therefore how we support citizens in their flourishing. So if you want to read something next, The Politics is a good book for you. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this series on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Bye-bye.